has been a campaign in recent years for a so-called home in government for the nonprofit sector at the federal level. Um, and certainly, there's been even some provincial movements in that way as well. Can you discuss your organization's support of this campaign and what it would mean to organizations in your province, especially perhaps if there had been a home in government during the pandemic? We would have seen a better response from the federal government and even provincial government to supporting the sector during this time when there was such increased demand and they were so hard hit. Do you think it would have made a difference?
Mm-hmm. I do. I fundamentally believe it would have made a big difference. I think to have a home in government really means a department, a secretariat, or a ministry that's responsible for championing the issues at a cabinet level or at a senior level that they hear, in this case, from the nonprofit sector, and also playing a coordinating role across ministries, whether it's Department of Labor that might deal with Statistics Canada, or other departments, Department of Finance, department that's responsible for heritage and things like that. So I do think that one of the dilemmas we had both provincially and federally during the pandemic was that there was no single place to go to advocate for what we were hearing that the sector needed. So in Ontario, for example, we work with 16 ministries, separate ministers' offices, separate public servants, on issues that range from police records checks to labor market data to transfer payment reform and grants and contributions. And no one has the overall responsibility to think about the health and well-being of the sector as a whole. They're all very focused, as their ministry or department is, on a specific slice of that. So not having anyone, either politically or bureaucratically, that actually has a mandate to think about the overall health and well-being of the sector is an enormous gap. And when you see how other industries are able to get that kind of support because they do have that, and my best example in Ontario is that there is an associate minister for small business. And during the pandemic, that minister had an advisory committee of small businesses giving him advice on what the small business community needed. And we were missing that key piece. And to their credit, the Ontario government invited ONN to sit at that table. So we were able to provide some input. But as one of many small businesses, there wasn't a specific advisory table of any sort for the nonprofit and charitable sector. So I think we missed out on huge opportunities and had to really fight to make sure that the wage subsidy, for example, Imagine Canada fought hard to make sure that charities and nonprofits were included in the wage subsidy, and the rent subsidy. And, we really had to fight our way in rather than have that champion, have that data we needed quickly, have a mechanism to have conversations and to convene the sector. So I think it would make an enormous difference. We're very supportive of a federal home and government campaign, and think it's complementary to having a provincial home and government as well.
Well, we recently spoke with the Parliamentary Secretary for Community Development and Nonprofits in British Columbia, which is the first province to have such a position within the provincial government. Has there been any movement on creating a similar position within the provincial government of Ontario? You've spoken a bit about the advantages that you would foresee, but going forward in the future, what kind of advantages would you have, and what is the status of any kind of advocacy in that score?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We also had the privilege of speaking to the Parliamentary Secretary Niki Sharma in BC and learning from her and sharing what was happening in Ontario. And I can tell you, BC just got an announcement of $30 million in funding support. And largely it's because they have an advocate, within government and a champion at the cabinet table. So that's a really tangible example of the benefit of having that sort of home and government. Or in the US, there's a campaign called Seat at the Table. So very similar concept. I think so. In Ontario, we have not had a department or a minister responsible for quite some time. A number of years ago, the Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration did have the nonprofit sector and volunteerism as part of their portfolio, but we haven't had that for quite some time. And so it is actually one of ONN's election asks as we head into the June 2022 provincial election here in Ontario. And we've been meeting with parties, all 4 parties in Ontario. We've been meeting with candidates, and they're very intrigued, I must say, all of them, cross party lines, about the concept of what that would look like, and how that could be helpful both to government as well as to the nonprofit sector. So we're actively promoting the concept of a home in government. We're actually working on doing some of our own research to think about, what could the model look like? It could look like a parliamentary assistant or an associate minister or a secretariat, or there's many models out there. So we're doing our homework to look at other jurisdictions and see what might be the right model for the moment in Ontario. But what we know already is we need political leadership, and we need to make sure that there's a connection with the public service. So there's a department or a budget associated. So it's not just political leadership, and it's not just a department. There's a real integration of those two things, and we know that that's what leads to success.
Well, we'll be watching the election very closely for that then. I've heard from some critics of the idea of a home in government, which suggested it might be a problem of putting all the eggs in one basket for the sector, and that having just one department to turn to and be a funnel, essentially, actually may make for more limited advocacy efforts, especially if the ministerial appointment was not knowledgeable about or overly supportive of the sector. What are your thoughts on that, and what do you feel the pros outweigh the cons?
Mm-hmm. I do feel the pros outweigh the cons for a couple of reasons. One, I think we can all agree that the sector government relationship needs to transform. It is not working, and we do need different ways and different avenues and transformation to do that. And I think there's many ways to do that, and there's no single way. I also think that a home in government having a department or a cross-sector table or organization will not change the fact that individual nonprofits and their subsectors have relationships with other ministries. So, for example, it won't change the fact that community health centers work with the Ministry of Health, or that sports and tourism organizations work with the Ministry of Culture, Tourism, and Sport. Those relationships, those funding relationships, those specific relationships to their subsector needs, that's critically important. And it won't replace that at all. But what it will do is elevate all of the issues that nonprofits and charities, regardless of geography, regardless of their size or what their subsector or mission are, that we all have in common. So things like data and labor force and how government grants are done, all of those things to create an enabling environment for all of us, we'll have somewhere that we can advocate, that we can work with on that level. Because individual ministries and individual departments often tell us, well, that's really interesting, but we're really focused on this aspect. Our mandate is only X, Y, or Z. So until we have someone that has that broader health and well-being of the sector as their mandate, we won't be getting some of the big transformational change that we really want to see.
Well, since we're talking about advocacy, I'd like to take a look at the bigger picture. How do you feel the nonprofit sector could improve in terms of advocacy with government at all levels? I've certainly spoken to some people who feel that in many respects, some of the leadership of organizations feel too vulnerable because of their dependence on government funding to be able to advocate, assertively without hurting potentially a revenue source, for example, or some political contacts. I wonder what your thoughts are around that.
Mm-hmm. I think there's always work to be done in our sector to be comfortable and develop the skills for advocacy, for sure. And we've tried to create some tools and training and things on how to advocate as a sector. But a couple of things come to mind. First of all, that organizations, individual organizations, can always be vulnerable if they're advocating to a funder or to someone that may have regulatory control over something that they're doing. So the power of collective advocacy, of networked advocacy, whether it's at a local level with a group of organizations in a geographic community, or whether it's at a subsector level, like all of the organizations that provide food bank services or food security get together, or at a provincial level, like with ONN, is really valuable because it takes the risk off of an individual organization. So I would say the more that we do collective advocacy, the more that we prioritize, those top few things that we all agree on, the more successful we will be. And that doesn't mean that individual organizations still can't advocate for the things that they want to see for their own organization or for their own community. But I think we do need to identify some of those big priorities that we have, and have share our key messages, sing from the same songbook, so that when we're all talking to elected officials and public servants, that we're all saying the same thing. And so there's a big opportunity for us to definitely do a lot more of that. I also think that the rules around advocacy, the lobbying registrations we have, the Election Financing Act, they are problematic. They do put the chill and fear in organizations and their boards of directors. And so we have to continue to advocate that it's okay for charities and nonprofits to be advocates. It's not okay to be partisan, but it's okay to advocate for public policy. In fact, if you're doing food security work, who better to advocate for food security issues? Because you know the issues on the ground. And nonprofits and charities are really that bridge between communities and government. And so we actually have a really important role to play in advocacy. So we do have to make sure that those rules don't scare people away, at the same time as encourage organizations to develop the skills and see advocacy as fundamentally one of the core strategies to meet their mission.
Really well said. I would love to hear from you what you think the top, say, 3 or 4, whatever you think you'd like to limit it to. What are the top advocacy issues you see as being most important to the sector in the coming year?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, number one for sure is staffing and volunteerism. Like our labor force crisis, being able to create decent work for our workers, to be able to make sure that there's wage parity between our sector and public and private sectors, to fill the gaps that are happening. A huge issue for our sector to recover from this pandemic. So we need better labor market information. We need better wages. We need all of those things that contribute to a healthy labor market, because at the end of the day, our sector is driven by people. It's the people that do the work, and we really need to support our people. So for us, that's number one. I think number two is around, financing and finances and transfer payment agreements. There's so much to be done to improve how the sector is financed. Grant making did improve over the pandemic. Lots of grant makers were quick out the gate, less reporting, quicker decisions. So what did we learn from the pandemic that we can apply going forward to be able to be nimble and supportive, and to encourage more grant makers and governments to do longer term granting that includes general operating expenses and technology, for example, which was such a problem during the pandemic that organizations didn't have technology. And then I would say the last one would be really around ensuring that the nonprofit sector is well positioned. There's going to be other crises. There have been, whether it's environmental forest fires and floods, whether it's a pandemic, to learn from our experiences, to figure out what we need to be resilient going forward, whether it's technology or our people, to really advocate for the sector to be part of the conversations on what we learned from the pandemic and help prepare us for whatever the next crisis might be.
Well, I want to thank you, Cathy, for your wisdom and insights into Bill S216 and its potential impact on the nonprofit sector across Canada, and your very eloquent discussion about the importance of advocacy and the ways that nonprofits and charities across Canada, and particularly Ontario, can bring their voices together to help make positive change. So I'm very pleased that you were able to join us, and thank you for your time.
No, thank you, Mary. It was a pleasure.